sorry? What's a wonk? You're looking at my LinkedIn profile right now? It's a term from U.S. policy, a wonk, a policy wonk, someone who holds forth on policy issues. So people who work at think tanks are wonks. I didn't know it doesn't translate. It's funny. Good morning. I had no idea that the Danish singers last night were enough to keep everyone out so late that we have a small audience to begin with this morning, but I'm certain people will trickle in. Thank you so much for joining us this early. For the digital revolution and the transport labor market, i.e. just what effect technology will have on employment in transport. I'm Greg Lindsay. I am a senior fellow at the New Cities Foundation. I'll be your moderator this morning. Joining me here on stage is an inestimable panel of gentlemen to really sort of help us tease out the implications of what all of these new revolutions, more than we can keep track, although I'll list off a few in a moment, are affecting digitalization of labor, basically who will be the winners and losers in these various areas, and sort of how these benefits will trickle down to the consumer as well. So with that, I'd like to quickly introduce the panelists. To my immediate left is Stephen Cotton, who's the General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation. To his left is Martin Blix, who's a research fellow for the Research Institute for Industrial Economics. He's from Sweden. To his left is Christian Lebreau, who's the president of the International Road Transport Union. And finally, at the end, is Randolph Worrell, who is the head of strategic partnerships at Movil Group, which is the mobility, that's a service company owned by Daimler. So I guess we'll begin by each gentleman will be making brief remarks. I, for my part, want to point out that that there is a whole whirlwind of different perspectives on this in terms of how digital mobility will in fact affect employment. Just in the last 2 days alone, there's been stories in the New York Times about Otto, which is a startup created by ex-Google employees, which are looking to automate the trucking sector, arguing that perhaps long-distance trucking and logistics may be the front lines of autonomous technologies with serious implications for employment there. I was just reading on the way here that Waze, of course, the Israeli company owned by Google, has announced a pilot for essentially a carpooling app in Silicon Valley, which adds this other wrinkle, which Uber and Lyft and others have sort of pushed at, where perhaps in the future we won't have to worry about autonomous cars stealing labor because you, the passenger, will be the labor yourself, driving yourself and others. So there are obviously interesting, so all sorts of wrinkle effects here that these coordinating technologies are driving through. So we're going to begin here with a sort of brief statement by each of our panelists, and then we're going to spend a bulk of the session conversing amongst ourselves and raising these various questions, and then of course we will turn it over to you, the audience, because there is as much, if not more, expertise in the audience than there is here on stage. So with that, I'd like to invite Stephen Cotton to begin with a few opening remarks, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. First, it's a privilege to be here and with such esteemed colleagues. This issue is of grave concern to the working men and women in transport. The International Transport Workers Federation represents 5 million members globally in all the transport sectors. And of course, this particular sector about what happens to jobs, sustainable jobs, as innovation takes over and moves into the process of grave concern to the unions and to their members. But I think the opportunity of engaging with this audience is to have a conversation about what needs to be protected, what's the methodology, how we can go forward. So there's a couple of things that I'd like to touch on, and it's kind of the stakeholders, the governments, regulators, employers, workers, all of us need to ensure that technological advances do not strip away the basis of our society. And of course, there's lots of issues over platforms, the new startups, the traditional employment relationships that are the cornerstone of a sustainable society. But of course, we're not going to sit here and say change is bad. We're ready to have a conversation about what change looks like. We also understand that it's crucial that we get it right. I mean, there are big issues about employment and the consequences for society over time. But as we move through a process, there's a combination of how do we tackle change, what's the responsibilities of the various stakeholders, and how do we build a policy that allows the transition to take place, but it also engages all of the voices in ensuring that the infrastructure we've built over many, many years is not destroyed in the rapid rush to go to a digital age that loses sight of our collective responsibilities to each other. So the panel today is going to talk about a number of different things, but we want to ensure that the new methodology does incorporate issues such as climate change. We're a strong advocate of transition to protect the global environment. That's not always easy in a union environment, and you can imagine even in transportation, some parts of transport are cleaner than others, and that conversation needs to be included in this process. In real terms, we in the ITF are consistent with our policy as we go forward. We're looking for a fair society, we're looking for good industrial relations. Our members, in whatever form and whatever challenges they have to take to be effective in the future, are looking for secure, sustainable, decent jobs that ensures that ever-growing equality in our society doesn't continue to grow, and there's a little bit more of a distribution of the share of the process. In real terms, by agreeing to be on the panel, by agreeing to have different engagements with the different parts of the different industries, we're determined to engage with all of the players in a very open and frank discussion. Now, of course, our membership will be and are gravely concerned about the very quick and rapid changing face of transportation. But all we're asking for is an opportunity to engage with how we do that. How do we make sure that the so-called fourth industrial revolution forgets the personnel that are part of the service provider? There's no opportunity to have a brave new world if there aren't consumers, which are ultimately the workers that are paying for these products. There are examples, and we can pick on of automation as the world changes, and we're going to pick on the Port of Hamburg, where there's been very good cooperation between the port operator, the unions, and they've managed to build an automated terminal that allows for the changing skills of the workforce, provides a better sustainable connection with the global supply chain. And those are the models where we want to talk about how do we build that platform going forward to ensure that, yes, change will take place, but how do we build an environment that is in everyone's interest? I don't know if there's any colleagues from Uber here, but it would be remiss of me not to mention them as the sort of lead vanguard of change. The ITF has been openly inviting them to a dialogue about how to manage change. Now, in some cases, there seems to be a lot of legal actions via a variety of taxi operators, unions, to list the number: United States, Belgium, Argentina, Brazil, where there's a challenge to their methodology of operation. Now, we've said to them, and we will continue to say using this platform, let's have a conversation. We are working with all elements, unions, employers, associations, to ensure that there is a fair say for the existing markets and a conversation of how it takes place. And these things have to be treated on a fair basis. Communication, we clearly understand that and there's considerable money being invested into a number of these platforms, and we're not against investment. In fact, we're very keen on investment. And the reality is, how do you engage with the stakeholders to build the change in a structured way that the concerns of everyone are taken on board, and we just don't ride roughshod over legal situations or legislation or regulations that have been built over tens of years or even centuries to protect both the consumer and the business in those processes. In closing, I'm looking forward to this conversation with some trepidation, depending on your engagement about questions for the labour movement, but very frankly, it's vital that we have the stakeholders having a fully encompassed conversation. Now, we know that history is littered with opportunities where things move forward and then we try to rebuild the infrastructure if we've gone too fast in certain processes. But from the labour movement, we've got an open mind. Of course, when platforms and apps don't envisage that people lose their jobs, and if governments can't see that there needs to be a process of potentially reskilling, re-engagement, different challenges, then we can potentially create our own mistakes. And opportunities like this with different views will give us a platform to go forward and hopefully engage in a constructive dialogue that will look after the interests of the working people, allow corporations to grow, manage transition, but in an effective and a fair and equal way. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Martin, please.
Good morning. So I'm an academic and I'm working on the economic effects of digitalization and also on the labor market, and I'm thinking about how it affects the welfare state. So what I would like to do in these short minutes is just to take a little bit of a step back from the day-to-day issues and to think about technology and the labor market, what happened over the last century, and then to raise that to the current issues. So in the past, we had a very positive development with technology and the labor market. The skills have improved, the productivity increased, and we had a very good real wage development. But in the last 3 decades or so, we've seen some change in the labor market. We've seen labor market polarization. So the middle classes have been thinning out, and the low skill, high skill areas have been increasing. And this is fairly uncontroversial. It's fairly well established in the literature. And this is a fairly broad change that's affecting a lot of sectors. And it raises a lot of questions about skills. It also raises a lot of questions about wage developments. For somebody who is standing in the midst of change, it can be quite important that to follow the skills and to be able to do the upgrade of skills that you were mentioning. So this polarization is affecting work in a variety of ways. And it's also bringing new opportunities. I mean, the automation is one thing that we're discussing, but for example, with the peer-to-peer platforms, there's some research in the US that shows that consumers, especially low-wage earners, can benefit a lot more from these peer-to-peer ride-sharing services, because they spend less money on the transport, and then they are better off. So in a sense, the resources are becoming better used. You can match demand and supply in much better ways. Things that were previously not possible to buy are possible to get even for regular households. So the consumption bundles of households and the services that households that can buy are changing, and it's improving in a lot of ways. But the risk of de-skilling is the one that I think we should be concerned about. If the pace of technological pace of innovation continues faster than we can adjust, then we need to think about what kind of how can the education system adapt. I mean, the system of having people in a lot of early years in education and one job, and then a little bit of on-the-job training and a few courses here and there, it probably won't be enough set against this labor market polarization and stagnant wages that we have seen. So probably we need to have a rethink about how we devote, the kind of resources we devote to education, and to think about lifelong learning. I would think that this is one of the key, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the key aspects to try to smooth this structural change. To get all the benefits, we need to also smooth the structural change from the digitalization. I think we also, I want to come back to that in the Q&A session. I also just want to talk about the risk sharing in society that you were alluding to in your remarks. The risks between insiders and outsiders. If we're seeing a lot of these platforms with on-demand work, how can we see that people are, the overall level of risk is not too skewed in society? What does it mean for income distribution? And here, it's both issues for the social security systems, where the people who are self-employed tend to be exposed to much higher risk, and also a question for the unions and the employer organizations, essentially going away from the predominant model where somebody's employed and thinking about possibilities when people are a much more fluid labor market. How can we ensure that the risks are not shared too unevenly? So I think I'll leave it in that in my opening comments and come back to those issues in the Q&A.
Thank you, Martin. A lot to discuss there as well. Christian, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. From my point of view, I will try to contribute a little bit from the industry point of view. IAU is not a union, also if we have union in our name. We are an employers organization working all over the world in more than 100 countries. And the IAU is the global industry association for road transport, driving the sustainable mobility of people and goods across the planet. And I think we have to look in a different way if we are talking about freight or people. So passenger transport, I think we have to discuss this as well. As IAU, we constantly try to improve the quality, attractiveness, safety, environmental and social sustainability of road transport services. And as such, the road transport industry fully embraces the digital revolution in the transport market. I think there are many chances, but of course many risks we can discuss. Also in the past, the road transport industry has been a driving force of innovation for many years, and is often instrumental in implementing new technologies, products and services, such as, if I look to IAU, electronic transport documents, ECMR, ET, we are working on this, or platforms like IAU Transpark for looking for safe parking lots, and for example, using already since many years platforms for freight exchange. That's not new for our business. We are using it for a decade already, and so we are moving forward in this region. And for example, IAU just created a new worldwide taxi app. It's UTOP. We can talk about this later on as well. And if I especially look to freight transport, then the road transport sector is confronted with a considerable driver shortage. If you, for example, look for Germany, where I'm working in my main job, and I'm president of IAU only on a it's not my daily work. So if you look, we will have a shortage of around 20,000 drivers a year for the next decade. So we are talking about 150 to 200,000 drivers missing. And if you look to the structure, we just set up in Germany and looking at this in detail. So 25% of all our drivers are 55 and over. So that's a quarter. And we have only less than 3% being younger than 25. So if you look at this share, so it will be some problems in the future too. And I think the digital revolution in the transport market, for example, through autonomous vehicles, might address also the shortage in long-distance road transport. And in addition, and as accompanying measures, drivers will need to be equipped with the right skills sets. And here again, IU takes the lead with its IU Academy and training programs. And to make it short, I think everybody should be part of the constructive dialogue we have to do for the transition period, especially, and of course for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Our final opening statement from Randolph, the relative odd man out who is not at a union or a labor economist. Please share your perspective.
Greg. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good morning, everyone. As Greg mentioned, I'm from Movil, and Movil has been incepted by Daimler. Actually, we started from Car2Go. Car2Go is now the biggest car-sharing scheme in the world. Obviously, you would wonder why an automobile manufacturer would incept car-sharing scheme, and that which eventually would lead to selling less cars. And I think the reason is the key topic also of this discussion, how to embrace the change that is happening through digitization. What we see at Movil is that more and more people are living in cities, and these people also have a bigger need for transportation, for mobility. And what digitization can do for this is to better connect the modes of mobility and the modes of transportation. If you offer the user a very good, easy to use interface, and this is given by the smartphone, to use various modes of transport, to connect between a taxi service and a public transport, that will also increase the overall usage of these modes of transport. And I think we all can learn a lot from the likes of Uber. If we look at the user interface, like the Uber app, for instance, the process is going through these apps, the user interface. This is really state of the art, and something that can be translated into public transportation as well. For instance, what we do is we help public transportation companies like TriMet in Portland to use now mobile ticketing, because that will certainly increase also the usage by people who maybe so far haven't used public transport. And so the key point for me here is, if you cannot avoid the change, how can you embrace it? How can you make use of this change and use it for the benefit of all the participants in this transport ecosystem?
Great, thank you. So, fascinating opening statements. A vowed allegiance to change in every case, even though there's this undercurrent of where is this all going. I guess I want to pose my first question to both Stephen and Christian, particularly as our union representatives, which is you talked about, and in our remarks beforehand, of course, talk about the notion of, we are in favor of change, we need to see innovation, but there should be fundamental protections left in place. There needs to be also a level playing field in terms of approaches to regulation. My question for each of you is, what is the bedrock? What has to absolutely be kept in terms of relationship between transport unions and labor and the technology companies that are out there? Because of course, we'll take Uber as the first example. Uber has made it quite clear that it's willing to spend what it takes legally to defend the status of its drivers as non-full-time employees. And of course, it's also made it equally clear that its end game is to turn the expensive labor into a capital expense in the form of autonomous cars. And then, of course, then in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, there's been a whole discussion about, perhaps we should give up on, unionized labor altogether, and we should move towards universal basic income, which is the notion which would allow companies to sort of pursue, this sort of increasing fluidity of labor altogether. So my question is where do you draw the line for each of you? What would you actually like to see as we go no further than this, and these are the kinds of protections that need to remain in place, even as we innovate on top of that?
Okay, thanks. Challenging questions. I don't think we're drawing the line on any issues right now because there's a lack of clarity about exactly the conversation. But it's clear if you, I think Martin probably touched on it, there's many questions about, so let's drop the workers and let's talk about human beings. So human beings have a desire for a degree of security. So at the moment, our society over hundreds of years has created the model of the human being gives their labour to somebody else for an exchange of value. Now, the growth of apps and the concept of an invisible, unidentifiable payer of that service is muddying the concept. So if you identify, if we take what Randolph said, that if you have an integrated app, you can provide a much better service. Martin mentioned you can help the lower paid by giving them more easy, seamless access to a process that can then drive economies and societies, fine. But you still have to have an answer to the individual about how they're going to be paid and who's going to pay them and what happens if they don't get paid. And I think there are lots of interesting studies, I think Canada, Holland, about what happens if you pay a minimum to society and that gives you complete freedom. But we're quite a long way away from getting to that boundary because there's a lot of people in societies, there's a lot of developing, in the developing world, there's certain concepts that you can have. Just look at Europe to pick the example. You've got the Nordic model with a higher tax, higher social security, a much better safety net than other places in Europe. And at the same time, we're dealing with 2008 austerity measures where the social security model's being reduced. So if you see a platform in, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess of a time frame, how do you provide for society for the security of individuals wanting that security and not becoming disenfranchised in a way to ensure that they can be paid and that they can have aspirations for their future, separate from what technology can provide? And I think that kind of, for us, we'd want to separate the conversation. We want some guarantees about who is going to make this regulation? Who do we sit down with? We're not saying we won't engage. I mean, in fact, we're saying the complete opposite. But if you rush off and you take away all the regulations and you dismiss national, citywide, whatever regulations, and we can use taxis as the example, you take all away those safety nets, background checks, who's driving who, what's the individual responsibility to the consumer, who's responsible if there's no tax paid, if there's no contribution to the state. Those questions need to be answered, or we need to have a forum to discuss those in a way separate from the apps, because the apps give, like, I'm sitting here with an iPad and my notes are on here. Great, I don't have to have a big wad of paper. Unfortunately, I still have a big wad of paper, but no problem. But what's the security for human beings? Because we are talking a potential enormous mind shift, model shift, and I don't think we're not spending all the money on building markets to invest in that element. And so who's going to put that money in to have that conversation? Where's that platform? So for me, it's not about what we won't do. It's about what does the future look like? Where do the individuals fit? What's government's responsibilities? Maybe the academics can help us start to visualize what a different kind of future might look like. But in the end, I think most human beings, and desperately want to hear from the audience, what do they feel? What's the security? Who's employing all the people in this room? A virtual employer, or do you all have contracts of some kind that provide you some guarantees?
Thank you, Christian.
Ja, ich glaube, es ist selten der Fall, dass sich
It doesn't happen very often that trade unions and employers associations agree on so many points as it is now the case with regard to what Stephen said. But I believe we have to distinguish between passenger transport and freight transport, where the situations are different in each case. Fundamentally speaking, both passenger transport and freight transport is subject to many regulations, not only in Europe, but also globally. We have social provisions working time provisions, including the need to pay taxes, what Stephen mentioned. And when we look at the digital revolution, when we look at all those apps being created, we need to make sure that we don't create vacuums where all those framework conditions do not apply anymore. Because if that happened, we would be dealing with two separate markets. I need to have the same market regulations in place. The same business, same rules, as the saying goes. This is one of the necessary preconditions that need to be in place so that the digital revolution can be implemented. If we don't have that, we will end up with a fiercely distorted competition leading to less safety, less security in the whole transport industry. Now, who is insured would be one question. If you use a normal taxi service, you are insured. If you're a passenger in a taxi, you would be insured. But if you take a Uber car, if you use Uber, the question of insurance is not settled. There are a lot of detailed questions that need to be addressed. And it is very important to apply the rule of same business and same rules. We must not admit exemptions and blurred areas where we have digitalized areas where I would not be subject to liability clauses, while in the traditional area our entrepreneurs would be subject to many rules and regulations. Now there's an endless list: cabotage, social provisions, two drivers, overnight stays and all that. This is where the challenge lies. We need to reconcile these areas. We need to make use of the opportunities posed by digitization without throwing overboard all the rules. And this is the complex task ahead of us.
And then Stephen, I believe, has a response as well.
Yeah, I think it raises two issues. One is about standards, and the other one is about transparency. It's really the insurance that you were mentioning and the risks of various activities. It's really a question about what kind of standards should we have for various activities. I mean, do you need to be insured for everything? Do you need to have the same standards for some of these apps as you do for professional work? In some instances, maybe you do, in some instances not. I mean, there are these on-demand things where you can cook food in somebody's kitchen. Do you need to have the same food safety, healthy, as you do in restaurants? I mean, there's a lot of these issues where we really need to have a deep discussion about what level of safety and protection is appropriate, and also that those levels don't necessarily cause protectionism to avoid how the market evolves. So I think one of the key things here is transparency, to be clear about what is the responsibility of the ones providing the service, and so the legal issues are at the forefront. About the standards, that I think is another track that's interesting to discuss. I'm aware of some union initiatives in Sweden where the unions are trying to have a discussion about labor standards for this kind of platforms, the on-demand work, and what kind of standards would you have to safety for wages? Should you have the same wages as in the collective bargaining agreements and so on? I think this is a very promising path to take. And it's really taking steps to think about how we can reduce the risks in these new kind of markets. But it's very early days, and the discussions need to be much more detailed, because I'm worried, so taking the perspective as an academic, that if we set the standards too high, we're going to risk dampening developments. But if we set them too low, then we get all these risks on the inequality that I was mentioning in my earlier. So the details really matter about the transparency and the standards.
Well, I had a quick follow-up question for you, Martin, which I thought was interesting from an historical perspective. So I mean, we've talked about, sort of Stephen alluded to this, it came up as the notion that we're in a very, very new situation here, that apps and the technology are driving this sort of time of flux when it comes to labor in this. But what's always struck me as interesting is that in many ways, these new services are very reminiscent of the sort of informal transport labor markets that already exist in cities across the global south. Just for example, I just wrote a story on jeepneys in Manila, which is semi-regulated, but is certainly not unionized or have no real protections. So my question is, I guess from an historical perspective, is how do we deal with this problem before when we had jitneys, which famously Travis Kalanick of Uber has called to bring back jitneys. We used to have big informal labor markets inside cities, and those were actually regulated. I mean, is there any lessons to be drawn from, when we dealt with this problem before, where we had all sorts of a profusion of informal transport everywhere, and then slowly that became professionalized and unionized?
That's a good question. I think that there probably are lessons to learn, but I mean the new issue, it's the on-demand platforms. They're not really doing something that hasn't existed before. It's just taking it to a much larger scale, and because the scale is larger, it becomes the safety issues are raised to a new level, and also because work is becoming more global. I mean, if we don't think about only but the transport sector, a lot of services can be performed on a computer globally. So the scale and the seamlessness of the apps raises the informal sector to a new level. So there are really new issues to deal with when we're making these things that were not so easy to do before.
Thank you. Randolph, you've been so patient, but I have a pair of questions for you now. One of which I'm curious about how public sector bodies, transit agencies, labor unions can sort of retake the initiative around this. I mean, you've talked about, the sense of Uber and others have put a tremendous amount of pressure on them from a design perspective and user experience perspective to improve themselves. So one, I'm curious about, have you seen any success stories? Have you seen any real interest where the sort of classic transit bodies have rallied and offered an innovative service and really made the case for themselves as essential and why you should continue to use them? And then the second question of that is that I'm unfamiliar with the actual implementation of Portland, Oregon's TriMet app, which is bringing in Lyft integration in thanks to Move's help. But I do know, for example, that in January, when another software firm, Transloc, announced it would help transit agencies in the US bring Uber into their system, I had a chance to talk to the CEO about it, and I specifically asked him about how the software would reconcile the fact that you have Uber as a part-time employee with unionized bus drivers, and the consumer would see a single experience. And his response was, from a technical perspective, it's 2 API calls, so it can exist technologically. But the problems that raises in terms of 2 wildly divergent sets of protections for the passengers or for the drivers would be something that would be pushed aside. And so I'm curious how you've seen this. I mean, the software that you create will allow us to bring all these different modes together without having to solve the necessary underlying regulation issues about it. So I mean, will they be solved, or will it simply just start evolving, and then these questions will never be answered in the forums that they would like to see them answered?
Yeah, well, that's a difficult question, actually, how it will evolve, and I think you made the point that will take quite some time, because nobody knows how this is going into the future, how much scale all these developments will get, apart from those that we can already see. The integration that you mentioned in Portland is that not only Movil provides the mobile ticket to the Portland Transit Authority, the TriMet, but also helps users that maybe at a certain point in time don't want to take public transportation to select another mode of transport. So they can either choose a car-to-go, that is a car sharing that I mentioned, or they can call Lyft, the competitor of Uber. And this basically, for me, is a sign that the public transport wants to connect the dots and wants to integrate with other transport providers or mobility providers. In how far now there is a look at the regulation that is behind it at the level of the transport providers. Lyft, for instance, a car-to-go, it's easy, the driver is the consumer. Actually, I don't think that is yet attacked as an issue. Not at all, actually. I think if you operate, as we do, we operate a meta platform. Movil is a meta platform. And below Movil are other platforms like MyTaxi, for instance. And there is the regulation of the taxi market. MyTaxi is an example where you have the normal taxi drivers, the regulated taxi market. And at that level, the regulation is happening.
Again, to follow up on the sort of first half of my question, maybe Christian can discuss part of this, is one of the things that the TNCs have done very successfully is to effectively demonize a lot of classic sort of transit bodies and taxi limousine commissions as protectionist, as in consumer unfriendly, as in in it for themselves. And I'm curious if any of you have seen examples of innovative bodies in this that have really made the case that that we are doing our best to innovate and that we deliver better value and better service for you. Because right now you're especially for the union representatives up here, you're losing that battle in the public opinion.
I believe we're more speaking about passenger transport, and indeed, and I don't get me wrong, I'm not in favor of more regulation. We're against regulation. But what I wanted to express is same rights for everyone, same market conditions on the markets that I'm working on. But to come back to the core of the question, apart from digitization and better opportunities and more flexible design of the access to combinations of different modes of transports that you have mentioned, changing from bus to bicycle or from car to go to light rail, subway, etc. That is an expression of the dissatisfaction of the users with the offer that is available so far, and that is the point. Here, the new digital opportunities made clear to us that for the established providers, and if I got your question right, that is your question, that this offer qualitatively is not flexible enough and good enough. So in many parts of the world, of course, there are taxi services that are expensive and not sufficient, not reliable. And that is a niche where these new offers take over. So I mentioned UpTop, an IRU initiative where we have a global app, or where we are creating a global app in which, with my mobile phone, I can use this app to order a taxi worldwide. And those who are behind the app in the individual countries guarantee that they have an insurance, that they observe certain standards, etc. But regarding quality, you're absolutely right. The development on the market has something to do with the dissatisfaction with the current offer of the established providers. And that is where the digital opportunities are pushing development.
Maybe I can add something to this. It's not always that now speaking of the public transport, that they don't want to embrace the change and that they don't want to adapt to it, to the new world of digital. It's very often also the case that it's quite complicated for them to do it because there's a very old heterogeneous system landscape and if you talk digitization, you talk system integration, you talk API, you talk open data and so on, and sometimes it requires a fair amount of investment and also of capability to do this and to move into this world. And more often than not, when we speak to transport authorities, we see that they're absolutely willing to do it, but this will take quite some time to transition into this new world. Often because also one public transit company is not a homogeneous block, but it's an organization of multiple transport suppliers organized in one group, Verbund in Germany. So there is the willingness to do something, and there's the understanding that something needs to be done. And you can see movement faster and slower. We have good examples in Germany where it has gone pretty fast. Some cities are very innovative. There's mobile ticketing. You can have bike sharing integrated, and you have car sharing integrated in the ecosystem of the public transport provider, either through Movil or independently. So I think in general it's accepted that there needs to be change, and that and as I mentioned beforehand, I see the arrival of new players as catalysts, as accelerators, and obviously now we all need to move into this direction and to adapt to it, because eventually the decision is made by the end consumer on what he uses and what he wants to do, and that is our call basically to adapt to that.
Thank you. Steve, I believe you remark, and then go back to question.
Just to, I think, it was a very provocative question, Greg, so congratulations. Demonising the sides isn't the solution. The reality is innovation is creating a lot of stresses. So at the same time, you've got a climate change argument, so we're having conversations about how you refresh your transport infrastructure. At the same time, we have to accommodate the blossoming innovation. So for me, it's a little bit more complicated in that sense. Of course, the world is continuing to change. Everybody wants to have a better experience when they're using passenger transport. Freight is very competitive already, and we need to kind of separate the two. Making bigger hurdles between the elements is not the solution for us. And you know, just you talked about the informal economy, and I can confirm with the support of some of the Swedish unions, we have organised the jeepney union in Philippines, in Manila, but that is because there is no infrastructure. So there's a conversation between what we have, where we have a investment over decades and regulation as a result of incidents, so health and safety reaction, and then you have an informal economy filling space because no one's rushing to Manila to build a bus rapid transport system or a metro or a model because of numerous national reasons. So, you know, they're all each issue, and that just gives you an indication of how complex this issue is, because is it the country, is it the city, is it the state? Each and every, you know, we went to, you know, we can look at the Uber legal situation in the States, and, you know, when you end up in court, we tend to say that's not the best way to find a consensus to deliver solutions, because you know, you need all the stakeholders to agree to an outcome, and judgments don't always give you that. They give you a winner and a loser, and that isn't what we need for this situation. We need all to be winners in different kinds of ways. Technology at one level, you know, the society as a whole, but also the individual or the worker, as I would describe them. So it's so complicated, and we have to acknowledge the stress, and we have to acknowledge that expectation of the consumer is growing, and we have to tackle that. But I would suggest it's not the union's job to tackle the regulators or criticise the innovators. We do what we do, we look after our people, and of course the employers need to have a successful business model. So thank you.
Martin, I believe you want to say something very quickly.
Stephen made a good point about we should not settle innovation necessarily through these court actions. The experience of Uber in Sweden, I think it's a little bit less contentious than in other parts of the world from what I've seen. We already had, I mean, one of the explanations could be, of course, that we've taken off our Viking horns and we're much nicer people, we don't fight anymore. But seriously, I mean, we had a deregulated taxi already quite before, so there's already quite a competitive industry. So it's not been as difficult. The questions that have been raised in Sweden have been about the taxes that are paid, especially from the Uber pop, and those are now been suspended in Sweden. And I think for the welfare states, these are the kind of questions that I'm thinking about and writing about. We need to think about how to broaden the tax basis and to ensure that we're also paying taxes for a range of services. And when it comes to paying income tax in Sweden, you can do it with an SMS or the mobile phone. You just press the button. But it's not the same, it's as easy yet with apps. But in principle, it shouldn't have to be hard as a self-employed or working as an Uber driver or whatnot in an on-demand platform. To provide the technology to pay taxes and make it as easy as possible. And that would remove one of the contentious issues. I know there's some work going on to do that, but here, the governments and the tax authorities also really need to pull ahead and try to be involved with the technology and to make it easy to do the right thing.
Thank you. I only wanted to do one remark to Randolph or but it's the same with the last remark of Stephen. I think all these new business models and new technology and everything around is moving much, much faster than the lawmakers are able to change the legislation. And that's a big problem we have if we talk about regulation of markets or the conditions for the same conditions for everybody. On one side, the technology and all the models are brand new, developing very fast, and the laws are always behind for, let's say, 2, 3, 5 years. And that's a problem we have to deal with too.
Well, another question for you. I mean, as you've noted throughout, we've been mostly discussing passenger vehicles. So I want to sort of do a twofold question where we discuss logistics and particularly the promise of autonomous vehicles happening here. As I mentioned at the top of the hour in my remarks, is that there's a whole body of thought around the fact that autonomous trucking will be on the roads before autonomous passenger vehicles, partly due to the expense, partly due to regulations. So my first thought when you mentioned there's a massive shortage of drivers in Germany, my first thought was those jobs will never be filled. That we could easily see, or many of those jobs will never be filled. We could easily see a switch to autonomous logistics well before that. So I'm curious your thoughts on some of the skilling issues that Martin raised here about what impact autonomy will have on trucking and to what extent. And then as a follow-up question after your remarks, Martin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I guess, if there's any historical analogs for this. I think of containerization in shipping as one of the great things that destroyed a number of jobs, but then created entirely new industries too. So I'm curious if there's any sort of big historical examples we can point to about what autonomous logistics might do in terms of employment. So, Christian.
Ja, ich glaube auch.
When we're talking about autonomous driving, I believe that this practice will first pull through in the professional sector, in the cargo transport, because that is the place where we have most progress and the organizational possibilities are given to implement these technologies in practice. I believe platooning and also the self-driving vehicle, that is something that we won't have to wait for many years anymore. Technically, it's already feasible, but it's also connected to many issues and questions, starting with transport and traffic safety, distances in between a platoon, between the vehicles, and down to detailed questions of, for example, energy savings. Do the second, third, and fourth truck save more energy than the first truck? Of course, the first truck still has to use as much energy as it did with the conventional technologies, and I believe there are also business models for that. But it's absolutely right. In a transport sector, we will come to practical use of that much sooner than in passenger transport. But we should not think that we'll be operating trucks without drivers entirely. I've mentioned regulation, and I think it will be a long time before in a platoon, the third or second or fifth truck will be driving without a driver. That is a solution that we will not see in any time soon, but we have different possibilities to use this labor force. There are many driverless subway train systems already, but I think in most countries there's still a driver in the train just in case. So that won't be the big solution for driver shortage. But for example, while the driver is operating an autonomous vehicle, the driver can carry out different tasks. So the job as such will change. Different qualifications will be required. And perhaps even, and that is a hope that we have in the transport sector, it will enhance the attractivity of the job driver. More technologies, more requirements to the driver based on the innovative technologies, and more different tasks for the driver. That will make the job more attractive. So that also means a change for the profession of driver as such, not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively.
The question about what happens when these jobs are automated, I think I'd like to come back to this overall perspective. I think what we need to do is to put the conditions in place that make it easy to make shifts between different industries and sectors as needed. And how do we do that? Because if we do put restrictions, then we're going to see jobs disappearing, and we're not going to see new ones created. So we need to have this possible reallocation of labor across industries and sectors. In Sweden, we had big sectors industries that went down. Shipbuilding, for example, is one. Clothes and various things were almost completely wiped out for a long time. So how do we reallocate? What kind of system can we have to shift labor between industries? Well, we have a system in Sweden where the labor market partners, the unions and the employer organizations, have these structural adjustment funds, so that when there's downsizing in a firm, then the people with jobs are protected. They can do retraining and they can find new employment. And it's a very broad possibility to change and to find new opportunities. So the motto has been protect the worker, don't protect the job. And in this way, we've sort of managed to combine the safety net with the willingness to embrace technology. And it's also, I think, made the unions a constructive partner in this structural change, instead of saying, okay, we don't want to downsize, we don't want to change, to be willing to take these steps. So it's really about the capacity to overall change for the labor market.
Thank you. I want to stay in the theme of autonomy for a second and ask Randolph a question about this. Projections for the impacts of autonomous vehicles range from, I've seen essays arguing that autonomous vehicles will kill air travel. People will be content to sleep in their cars on long-distance intercity voyages. But I've also seen projections that that autonomous vehicles could be well integrated into public transit. They could solve the last mile issue, which already TNCs like Uber and Lyft and others have argued that they're actually accentuating transit. So I'm curious from your perspective at Movil, given the suite of capabilities you have here, is there a scenario where increasing autonomy could we could see fleets of managed autonomous vehicles could work extremely well with public transit as it exists and lead to catalytic increases in terms of people using public transit? It could be a boon to that. I'm curious that or other scenarios you could imagine from what you've seen.
Well, I can imagine that it wouldn't make a lot of sense to have a lot of individual autonomous vehicles streamed through cities, but always a combination of a mass transit solution and an individual solution. Already from the point of view of availability of traffic infrastructure, I don't think that it will totally be individualized, what we see in autonomous driving, but I do believe that a thing like a robo-taxi will play a very big role, but also contributing to a larger infrastructure, mass transit infrastructure, that will cover the major axis, for instance, of an ecosystem in a city. So obviously, it's very hard for everybody to say what will happen in this respect, and I think it will also depend a lot, again, on what the regulator does and how the cities deal with it. For instance, probably it's not desirable for a city to have so much individual traffic, no matter if autonomous or not autonomous. So how do you deal with that? You can create special zones. I think there are a lot of opportunities to free cities of traffic, to create more space for pedestrians, for cyclists, etc. So there will be a lot of concepts, I think, and maybe we should look into some cities in the world which are quite advanced in traffic concepts as a whole, like Singapore, for instance, to get a glimpse on what might happen. That's all. Nobody can really say what's going to happen.
It's funny you mentioned Singapore, because the last question I have before we open up to the audience I want to ask is Singapore to me is a really interesting example there of a public body that is, to use Stephen's comment from earlier, has really sort of been able to grapple with the fundamental underlying issues and not been totally reactive to the technology. They have a very emboldened civil servant corps that's understanding this and trying to get to it. And so the last question I have for each of you, Martin, if you want to jump into this, is I'm curious, we've talked a lot about, convening, we've talked a lot about having, essentially fora to really discuss this and having all the stakeholders together. The popular narrative, of course, is that the technology companies take the initiative and that people like you essentially are forced into reactive crouch to it. I'm curious if you have any interesting examples, successes you want to share of being proactive about it and really thinking about what are the adjacencies here of how this technological shift or the next shift will affect labor, and really sort of moving quickly to address those issues and get that in place before it becomes a question of, you're having to sue someone, or we're seeing, nations banning various services because they simply cannot get a handle on the various issues involved. So I don't know, Martin, if you'd like to say something completely separate, please. You jumped in before I asked a question.
I just wanted to raise the issue of infrastructure. We talked a lot about regulation and the labor market, but to have these autonomous vehicles, the platooning that you were mentioning earlier, it's quite possible that we need to have other supporting infrastructure built to really get those benefits. I talked to Volvo and Scania, and some of the examples that I've heard is that if you have these autonomous trucks that are driving, for example, in platoons, and then suddenly they hit a red light somewhere, that's going to reduce some of the fuel benefits and some of the efficiency savings. So probably we need to also have an infrastructure around that allows us to, first of all, get the benefits, but also perhaps to reduce some of the risks. And these kind of issues are going to be more important also, and that's probably one of the reasons also why it's going to take more time to get the government involved and to help to build the supporting infrastructure that can help to get the benefits.
Yes, of course. I think especially in Germany, if you are looking to an initiative of our government in southern Bavaria, we have a digital test field on the motorway. Testing all these digital things, from communication from truck to truck and other cars, communication with emergency and everything what you can do. That has been an initiative not done by the industry or the automobile industry. It has been done by our government, and it's. I think it's very fruitful to test it. But if you allow me, I want to make a short remark about the discussion we had before. You had been talking about containers and losing employment and so on. It's different for the freight transport sector. It's different for passenger and freight. As I said before, in the freight sector, we have a real driver shortage, and this revolution will help us to fill the gap we will have in the following years, and to make the job as a driver more attractive. So it's a positive development. I think it's from the other point of view. It's not a negative one.
Would anyone like to answer any of my other questions? Stephen, do you have any particular examples of what are the successes in this?
I think you kind of. I visited Singapore with the government, with the unions, and looked at their integrated transport system. And I think, in a way, irrespective of applications, cities have a problem. Capital investment in infrastructure is not so easy to raise. And now we have the changing face of transportation. I'm talking passenger transportation here. It makes it more difficult for people to raise the capital to invest, as I said earlier, climate change, recognition that we need to do more, but then, visit a capital city that isn't with so many man hours lost in, gridlock in transportation. So Singapore has built a retail, rail, bus model partly because of their ability to plan in advance. And I think that's that conversation is the same conversation. The opportunities that apps will give us to integrate and maybe be even more forward-thinking is a good opportunity. So, again, I think when we said stakeholders, or the opening that I made, it's all about stakeholders. Somebody has to lead. you know, we've got to look after our members, and we're very proud of that. But in reality, someone's got to step out of our localized conflicts and say, right, what's our bigger plan? Because, you know, you've got to bring all the elements together. Climate change, society, you know, there are different successful models. The Nordics do have a much more sophisticated and legal infrastructure backing up their union relations. On the other hand, if we continue to push and drive for the subcontracted employment methodology, which is the fear from our side, and it continues to create a bigger degree of instability, which is then a disincentive to invest in the infrastructure. So you've got to have a model of maturity that brings all the people to the table, and you know, our position will be and continue to be, we want to be at that table. I'm not sure if we invited everyone, they'd join, so.
All right, well, great. Well, I've asked enough questions, unless you'd like me to ask some more, so I'm going to open up to the audience here. I do hope, I know we have a representative from Uber here, I do hope we get a question from him. But would anyone else? Any other questions from the audience right now? Here, I thought you were dying to ask questions this whole time. Anyone? All right. Let me think of another question. My notes. Well, I guess I'm curious. I want to go back, Christian, some of your thoughts here. I mean, you mentioned the beneficiality of this. I'm curious, what ways, can you talk a bit about the specifics in terms of autonomous trucking, for example, and what you're thinking of more of human-machine interface in this? And I'm curious, the digitalization of labor, we've talked about it so far, is led mostly by me in terms of destroying jobs, but I'm curious if there are areas you've seen in which we can see more sort of man-machine enhancements. I mean, this has been a lot of the discussion around artificial intelligence, right? That humans and AIs working together will be much more powerful and beneficial. How does that play out in the sort of, transport labor market? You mentioned trucking and other sort of areas along those lines.
Ich glaube, wir werden durchaus.
I believe that we're going to see positive developments alongside the entire supply chain as a result of digitization. We're going to see an improvement of the working conditions for the entire staff. If I just think of freight transport, it could start with making the job of the driver easier through an electronically guided driving. I'm not yet talking about autonomous driving. I'm just rather would be talking about a vehicle with a lot of driver assistance systems. And this has an impact on many other areas, on the environment, for instance, on road safety. If I just take a cruise control, which is GPS controlled, which knows that there will be a steep incline in 500 meters distance. It can change the gears in time. These are all advantages of digitization. It makes the job of the driver easier. It eases the burden on the environment, and it can save fuel costs all at the same time. But it wouldn't stop at the vehicle. We can also think of data exchange alongside the supply line. If I just think of the locations where the freight will be unloaded or loaded, where a driver can register in time that he will come in at a certain time, or they can announce a delay automatically, announcing that they wouldn't be able to use their earmarked slot, so that dispatchers there can coordinate things in a different manner. So these are positive influences we're already seeing out there, but these positive influences are going to become increasingly important the more that we integrate all parts of the supply chain, and this can be done via digitization.
Any questions from the audience yet? Yes, we have one. And we have another over on the side next.
Thank you very much. I'm Toshi Osawa from World Customs Organization, from the Customs Administration. So I want to know that the experience of the IRU, so regarding the data exchange with customs, because I know that the IRU is a leading agency of the electronic TIR carnet, that you have several pilot projects. So I think it's a very good example of how you involve the different stakeholders to promote the paperless, the environment, paperless trade. So the digital customs is one of the main topic of the World Customs Organization this year. So that in this regard, I want to run the experience of the IRU, particularly the area of the electronic TIR carnet. Thank you.
Yeah, vielen.
Thank you very much for your question. I already mentioned in my introductory remarks that the IRU, and you're talking about freight transport now, I already mentioned that we want to get a lot of benefits of digitalization. I mentioned ETIR, the electronic TIR. Now, for those who are less familiar with freight, IRU is the carrier of the carnet tier customs procedure with a sealed truck. With this carnet, you can sign through all signatory states without the need to open without the need to deposit taxes, without the need to declare your loading. It just makes the transit through various countries easier. It is a transit system which so far had been paper-based, as the colleague said. And through data exchange, we had safety, for instance. We try to get feedbacks on the correct processing of any given carnet, but the IRO goes beyond that electronic data exchange. At the end of the day, this customs guarantee procedure should be totally paperless in the future. There is currently a pilot project going on, very successfully so, between Turkey and Iran. We don't have a paper carnet anymore, but only an electronic one, which would be deposited in the respective computers. Transport operators have access. Customs authorities have access to this carnet. And this makes the whole procedure much more flexible, much leaner. Through digitization, I can adjust the guarantee sums much more flexibly. This carnet is available in various versions, depending on how many borders I have to cross. A transport operator has to consider up front how many of these carnets do I need for this stretch that I have to cover? How many borders will I have to cross? So in the future, the operator would link up digitally. It would have his electronic load certificate, and he can then determine the guaranteed sum they have to deposit. So we will be able to do everything that would not be able to be done on the basis of a paper-based carnet. It's another advantage. And the customs authorities have a much more direct access to the chain of guarantee in order to be able to prevent abuse. There is a very successful pilot project going on between Turkey and Iran, as I said, and there are plans to expand that pilot project to various other states. In the long run, sounds so far away, but still, in the not too far away future, we will need regulation. We're talking about a UN convention which needs to be amended so that we would have the authority to do everything digitally, but work is underway and we have advanced.
I had a question back here, a lady there in white collar, please.
Grimm, economist. My question relates to the costs side and impact of the digital revolution on labor costs and technology costs. When we talk about seamless transportation chains, supply chains, digital revolution, autonomous transport, we have a security issue with it. And as we know, it's a continuous money-chewing effort to upgrade security systems. And the more complex a system is, the higher the costs will be. So how many costs do we have to expect when we go digital everywhere in seamless transportation chains for security-related aspects? This leads me to the second question. This is how many jobs will get lost. At present, we do spend money on human beings. In the future, most of the budget will be spent for technology. So what do we have to expect in terms of foresight already midterm? We do had a discussion at the World Economic Forum related to the future of jobs in transportation. And this pointed out that most of the jobs in transportation will get lost but shift to other sectors. How do we have to handle that? Thank you.
Gentlemen, in the interest of time, please choose one question or the other if you feel so inclined.
I can answer attempt to answer the second part about the labor. I mean, I don't think that jobs at the overall level are going to disappear. There was this work a few years ago that said that 50% of the jobs, or more exactly 50% of the tasks, are going to be automated within the next 2 decades. But that's tasks, and it only thinks about the job destruction. So the point that I've been emphasizing in my talks and in my work is the reallocation of work. There will be new jobs. We cannot even probably think about the jobs that will appear in the future. Maybe 15 years ago, we could not imagine the kind of new jobs that are appearing now. The issue is really, are they appearing at a fast enough pace? And there I'm worried that the pace of job creation might be a bit too slow. And that creates some problems. But at the overall level, I'm not at all. I think that this issue that you raised about basic income, I think this is not on the table. We've managed these kind of transitions before, but the key to managing it is really to embrace the ability to change and the skills upgrade. Without the skills upgrade, we're going to see the cost. We're going to see continued slow wage growth, and the transition cost of dealing with shifting to sectors is going to be much harder. So those are the key issues that I would like to return to.
Yeah, I would also maybe comment on the second question regarding the transition, and it adds to what Martin said, that it's incredibly difficult to find people with the right skill set. I mean, our company is an example of a newly created company dealing with a digital platform, and we are roughly now 200 people in Europe and 200 in the US, and it's in such a company, a tech company, you try to have a majority or at least half of people who deal with the product development, IT, programming of the apps, iOS and Android, etc. And it's incredibly difficult to find good people doing this in the whole market everywhere. And of course, this will take a lot of time because you have to have universities and academia that develops these people, and until you have them, it will take another couple of years. So there's a huge, I think also a huge liability and a huge responsibility of the universities and of the academic world to help fuel this system with qualified people. Otherwise, we will also, also certain countries will lag behind other countries if we don't adapt to the required skills in computer science, for instance. It's very, very important.
Thank you so much. Other questions? I believe I saw some other hands out there. Gentleman here in the front.
Danke. Mein Name ist Thomas Grätz.
My name is Thomas Grätz of the German Taxi and Rent Car Association. I would like to connect to what Martin said, that Movil in Portland also is connected with LIFT from a European point of view. LIFT is the attempt to provide private car services on a commercial basis, which fortunately in Europe has not been successful yet, relying on national regulations. My question is there a general guideline for Movil with whom they cooperate with when it comes to national private car services? If that were allowed, would Movil do that? If the rest of the world said, no, we are not in, would Movil be out as well? The answer to the first question is something that I would like to explain in more detail. The connection with Lyft in the app of the Portland Transport Authority is done through TriMet. So what happens in the app is that a user of TriMet can call a Lyft car, and Movil provides a piece of technology that makes this connection possible. So that means that that's not really the point. Your question goes more towards whether we as a platform ensure that Uber encounters suitable service providers here in Germany. We do that. In Germany, we have My Taxi, also all over Europe, which uses normal taxi drivers. And of course, we obey the standards that apply in the individual countries. That is, of course, something that we cannot change. Okay, so a general exclusion is not possible. It would be due to national regulation, also the connection with private car service providers. So far, this question has not arisen. We can't act outside the national legal framework. We also have terms and conditions that apply or that include national regulations. So we have to make sure that we obey the rules that apply in the individual country for the service that we provide for the end consumer. I think I have answered this question. We obey national rules as they exist. And that is what we have done so far.
Gentleman here and then there. He's in the orange tie.
Stefan Back from the Confederation of Swedish Transport Enterprises. Yesterday morning there was a session about the future of the car, and there was an entrepreneur called Robin Chase from North America, which was a very clear supporter of the sharing economy and autonomous driving vehicles. And she basically said that during the coming 20 years, cities will be transferred because we will have autonomous driving and sharing to extremely high degree, and that European vehicle producers don't understand that and can be run over, so to speak. I get the feeling from the discussion here that you seems to be much more cautious about the development of such city mobility changes. Maybe someone can confirm that. A thought that has been touched on is that if she is right, to at least partly right, a lot of driving work in the cities will be lost because of the autonomous drivers and so forth. And then my thought is, if you look at who is driving taxis and buses in the big cities, it is often immigrants that has their first work in the new country. So could it be that this will be a stress on the society, because if those jobs are no longer there, will politicians be cautious to support this development because they are afraid of the implication in the social system and so forth? That's my question.
Thank you for your question. It's difficult to be more optimistic than Robin Chase. I don't think we can be. But I loved his question, and I particularly want to add another measure to it, because we've mostly discussed, global north markets and discussing highly skilled transport labor. So in addition to his question about immigrants here in the global north, also in places like the Philippines, jeepney drivers, for example, are the poorest, the most recent arrivals, they are the most unskilled, and they create very influential voting blocs in those countries too. And so my question is are they destined to be dispersed and hopefully, you know, absorbed somewhere else in the economy then, particularly in sort of global South markets where these are the jobs of first resort for the most unskilled?
I think, as regards to the first question, maybe you can formulate it such that, I mean, we're talking about the pace of technology as a one-dimensional thing, but it's not. I mean, in some areas it's going to be very quick, especially those that are consumer-driven, where people vote with their feet. In other areas where there's a lot of heavy infrastructure, regulation involved, Internet of Things, the legal issues and the regulatory framework, everything takes much slower. So that in some areas it's not going to be as fast. So I think that's a partial issue, that we can be overwhelmed sometimes by the pace in some areas and think that that's going to extend to everything else. No, it's not. I mean, I think the areas that have been first are the consumer ones, where the consumers are voting with their feet. On the other issue, on the immigrants, I think it's a fair point that some of these jobs, driving taxis, are going to disappear. But I think that the on-demand platforms, peer-to-peer, are going to also create a lot of new jobs. And they're really creating a global labor markets, which have opening up job opportunities within the country, within the cities, to match somebody who has something to do with somebody who wants to have something else done. And it's also the global aspect. You can go on apps such as Upwork, and you can buy services from somebody doing proofreading, computer programming, or whatnot. Anything that can be done on a computer can be done globally. So it's not only removing some jobs, it's also creating new ones. And I think that's an important aspect, because, like you said, the first job of an immigrant is not going to be as a permanent job in a firm. They're going to be self-employed. And then one, I think, really beneficial aspect of these on-demand peer-to-peer platforms is something we haven't really talked about here at all, and that's the digital reputations. With digital reputations can become much more important sign of somebody's work abilities and reliability than any sort of paper that you could put up. So when people rate each other, you know that this person is a good worker, they have a good track performance, and the same for the employer. The employer, people don't want to work for employers that are behaving badly. So these digital platforms, when they provide reputation mechanisms, can be a new way to help people to new jobs, which could be in part compensate for these kind of jobs that would be disappearing.
I think we started this session talking about the challenges, and now we're getting the questions. We're starting to be able to list those challenges, and I think it goes, you know, when I said don't demonise the application developers, because if we are in a dialogue with some of them, they're just trying to create an environment of better opportunity. Of course, there's money at the end of this process. And that then lays, I think, the challenge of the last two questions are the challenge back to governments. If corporations aren't taxed efficiently and effectively on their revenue, how can we rebuild the education systems? How can we rebuild the cities in an appropriate way to address the issues? Now, if you, and I'm sure many of you do, visit the big cities in Asia, in the global, the problem isn't too many cars on the road. The problem is far too many cars on the road, and automated new vehicles isn't the solution to the environment, and also the congestion and the loss of time, which ultimately impacts on the economy. So the conversation about what new cities need to look like, or the revision of our old cities to make an infrastructure, is ultimately a political question. And then that comes back to immigration, quality of jobs, sustainable opportunities. Now, you know, we talk to many of the employers' associations, and because of the shortage of labour, not just in trucks but also in metros and those systems, they are looking to the immigration opportunities to secure extra skills, good quality jobs with decent salaries that can make a contribution to society. So in the end, technology will create our society bigger and bolder questions about how do we tackle that. And I think that, you know, the conversation is back to governments. Let's talk about it, because it's not a 5-minute solution. And I think you're genuinely right, and you can see it. I think perhaps it plays out more naturally in North America because of the multitude of different regulations, city by city, state by state, which then impacts on the political forces that say yes or no to regulation change. Our problem is perhaps we don't know what everybody's doing, and our conversation today is to say, let's talk about it. We're in a ITF joint venture with IRU about the future of automated trucks, because we need to know what's going on so that we can advise the global unions what's the strategy, and we would invite other parties to tell us. We know about potential for ships without seafarers, and there's research going on there. But the trouble is it's all going on in splendid isolation and perhaps for different reasons. And if we identify what the reason is, you know, we all have to be stakeholders in a sensible, structured outcome, then we've got the opportunity of kind of creating a playing field that respects the existing players, encourages investment in the solutions, but also protects the interests of workers.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I believe this gentleman had a question over here.
Wolfgang Severing, ich arbeite für das
Wolfgang Sievering, I work for the Federal Authority for Cargo Transport in Germany, and one of our tasks is the development of transport markets, looking at it, analyzing the results. We have many dialogues with stakeholders on transport markets. That also includes the development of the labor force on the transport markets and how companies deal with digitalization. Christian Labro just said that at the moment there's a shortage, for example, in truck drivers. That's not only an absolute shortage, also if you look at the age group of the current drivers, the stronger age group of truck drivers is the group 55 plus. So here we have many workers who are not really digital natives. And in conversations with the drivers, with the companies, we hear that there's a lot of anxiety among the older employees of falling behind, and that creates stress. Stress can lead to dropping out from the working life earlier, and we see that with the truck drivers, but we also see it in smaller transport companies, family-owned businesses with few workers who have the same problems and who are worried about falling behind and dropping out of the market. My question is how this anxiety can be tackled in the short term. How can older drivers and small companies be supported to make the transition into the digital world in a stress-free way? I will answer briefly, or I'll try to be brief. Indeed, we have a gap here, and I already mentioned that during this discussion. There are less than 3% young people, at least in Germany, but I also think in other countries. I also talked to colleagues from Canada and from the US. They had the same figures. So I say 3% of our workers are under 25 years, and they are the digital natives. And as Mr. Sievering already said, 25% in Germany are 55 plus. So that's a generation that is very far away from the digital developments. They have a smartphone, if anything. And I think in this field we can only advance through training, through qualification, to make sure that we preserve these jobs and these people in these jobs and to qualify them for their task. I think it's one of the main tasks, main responsibilities that we have for our employees in the field of transport and logistics. We have to enable them, we have to qualify them more to meet the future requirements. That's one point, but also to gain a workforce at all, because we're in competition with other sectors. And no matter whether I'm talking about a taxi driver or a truck driver or a dispatcher or somebody who works at the loading ramp, the image of the transport sector as a whole, in cautious terms, is not the best. So these skills are also a way to work at our image. And I think that is also one of the responsibilities of the IRU. And through the IRU Academy, we try to set global standards for training, for education. And we are in good conversations with Stephen's organization about that. But in the short term, to answer to the question, qualification, qualification, qualification.
Thank you all so much. To sum up the session, we will all get old, we will all be disrupted, and we have to work at it. So I'd like to could we please give a round of applause to our panelists? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your questions. And I get the feeling this will be a perennial topic for every ITF summit, so I look forward to this next year as well. Thank you.